Thanks for joining me for the forum today. So as you know, we're starting our Sesquicentennial celebration of this building. So 150 years on October the 9th. This building was rededicated after being rebuilt following the Chicago fire. In 1871, it burned down to the ground on October the 9th as part of the Great Chicago Fire. And within 4 years, the congregation rebuilt the whole place, paid off all the debt, and rededicated it, which is just an absolutely amazing feat, especially given the fact that they all lost everything themselves in the fire. Of course, these were the movers and shakers of Chicago that were members of St. James. So they had the means to do this, but even still, it was a matter of everyone giving sacrificially of themselves to make this happen, which is such an inspiring story. But our story goes back even longer than that, because the parish was founded in 1834. It was one of the first churches in Chicago, the first Episcopal church. And music has played an integral role throughout that time. So you can see here's the sort of assembled musical forces that we have today. So for nearly 200 years, our building has evolved. We've been in different locations. Our liturgy has evolved. The sorts of people that make up the choir have evolved and changed greatly, you'll find. But our commitment to music has been a consistent value in this parish from that first service in 1834. So we go back to, I found one picture of the original building, which goes back to 1837, at the time when this organ was built. The first services were held actually in another church, but they built this building shortly after. It was down at Wabash in Illinois, then known as Cass in Illinois, so just a little bit further toward the river. A pretty simple little building, but they were already committed to getting the best music that they could at that time. So they commissioned Henry Urban from New York, who was America's most preeminent organ builder in the early 19th century, to build a small organ for their church. It was one of the first organs in the state of Illinois. And Henry Urban also built organs for Trinity Wall Street and several other prominent Episcopal churches at the time. As was sort of traditional for the choir at this time, there was a small unvested choir, so they didn't wear this stuff. They just wore whatever they were wearing, and they sat in a rear gallery somewhere in the church. We don't really know much more about this building other than this picture that we have. So a pretty modest little building. It was probably a much more like Protestant low church experience of worship than what we have today, just based on how the Episcopal Church was developing at the time. So as Chicago grew, St. James also grew. And as I mentioned, a lot of the movers and shakers of Chicago were parishioners. So if you go into the narthex, you'll see all of these plaques with these names that sound familiar because they're the names of streets in Chicago, like Quincy and those sorts of folks. They were all members here, so they outgrew their little church, and they wanted to move a little bit further away from the river, which was becoming slightly seedy at the time, particularly the north side of the river. So they moved up here to Cass and Huron Street. So on the present site, they built this building, which is very similar to what we have today, not quite the same. It was started in 1854, but not completed, and they didn't pay off the debt until 1871. So this building took them quite a long time to build. It's of the English Gothic style, or sort of their perception of what English Gothic meant at the time. So you can see from the window particularly, that's like the biggest difference from our current building. Looks very much like a Gothic cathedral facade there. So at that time, the music in this space was largely becoming professionalized. They moved away from having a volunteer group to what was really fashionable at the time, which was to have a quartet of soloists. So if you see the organ loft the way that it is now, not the one that the choir sings in, but actually the one with the organ in it on the transept, there's that weird little space right in front of the organ. Originally, that would have had the organ console in the middle, and they would have put two singers on either side. So they designed it for a quartet to sing. It was probably opera singers that would come here as their Sunday gig. So a very different kind of musical leadership, much more sort of introverted and polite, I think, in the Victorian era. So as I mentioned, in 1871, the church was finally being completed. They were finally paying off the debt. We were coming out of recession, we were coming out of the Civil War. There were all sorts of things that were causing this to take a long time. So the church was really starting to go gangbusters in the late 1860s. So they recruited America's top organist, Dudley Buck, in 1869. He was an absolutely phenomenal organist. I played some of his organ pieces, and they are extremely hard to play. His technique was beyond anything anyone in Europe had at that time. It's much harder than like César Franck or Jean-Marie Vidor or anything like that. He was clearly a virtuoso. And we'll be singing one of his pieces on our upcoming concert a week from Thursday. So hear a little bit of a taste of what his music was like. As you can imagine, it's very sort of Victorian, mushy, sentimental, maudlin kind of music, but really quite a lot of fun and very, very different sort of thing. So Dudley Buck, they wanted him so badly, they recruited him with the golden package. They built a brand new organ for him from the organ builder that he was basically a representative for, the Johnson Organ Company. They were overtaking Urban as the top organ builder in the country. So they built a new organ in 1870, put it in the space that's equivalent to where our main organ is today in that transept. Not only did they do that, they built him a house just a block over with a music room that had its own organ and seating for 100 people so he could have salons and parties and all this stuff. Yeah, really amazing. And this was Chicago saying, like, we're not going to be a pioneer city anymore. We are going to be a cultural capital. So the people of St. James were really invested in that movement to make Chicago culturally the leader of the country. It's the same time that the Chicago Symphony was getting started. It was a lot of the same people who were working to bring Frederick Stock over to start the CSO. It was a decade later or so. Same time as the Art Institute was being founded, the Newberry Library, there was this major cultural re-upping of Chicago, and St. James was a core to that. So they brought this genius organist in. He was here for only about a year and a half, and then while he was on tour on the East Coast, he got a telegram that everything he had here had burned down. The church had burned down, his house had burned down, all of his music, all of his manuscripts, everything had gone down in the Great Chicago Fire. So he actually never came back. As far as I know, he never even returned to Chicago. So for the rest of his career, he was in a couple Protestant churches in Brooklyn, and he's mostly known for his work in Boston. So he's sort of seen as like a New England composer, but he was in Chicago for a couple of years. So this is a really wonderful photo that I was able to find of the church post the fire. So this is probably in the winter right afterward, because you can see some of the snow around and things like that. But of course, famously, the bell tower stayed standing, and that remains today. But you can see some of the wall structures remain. As far as we know, those were taken down, and then a lot of the stones were reincorporated into the new design because the layout of the church is slightly different. But some of those walls did, barely manage to stay up. I just love this photo so much because you see the regrowth of this tree kind of sprouting up, and somehow those trees managed to survive, which is just remarkable. Really amazing how those things work out. So if you can just imagine, coming back and seeing like this church that you've just poured all of your congregation's fortune into, reduced to that, and then to the reaction to be, let's build it again. That is just, I think, so stunning. So when they rebuilt it, they built a new Johnson organ designed after the one that Dudley Buck had installed, but slightly bigger. They had like 2 or 3 more stops. And they decided, rather than just return to what we were doing before, we should be on the forefront of what the Episcopal Church is doing. So St. James soon found itself at the beginning of the burgeoning Anglo-Catholic movement, the idea that we should be reclaiming some degree of liturgy and ritual into our worship. It's not just a place to go hear a sermon, but actually it's a place to receive a sacrament. And that translated into the music in some interesting ways. So even though this Johnson organ has the space for the quartet choir, that probably only existed for a few years, because within a couple of years they started to install the choir stalls in the chancel that used to exist there. And they started a choir of men and boys. So you can see some of the men and boys. This is the earliest picture I have of them from the 1880s. I'm not sure where they took that photo. It must be some studio or something, because I can't recognize any sort of columns like that in St. James. But that's sort of the early days of the choir here, beyond just a quartet of singers. So this was very fashionable at the time to start a choir of men and boys modeled after the English cathedral tradition. It was pioneered by a Connecticut Yankee named Dr. William Bibbert, and he was taking what he had experienced in Connecticut of this growing high church Anglo-Catholic movement and brought it to Chicago. It's apparently quite controversial at the time, and a lot of people were upset at this creeping Catholicism into their worship style, but they eventually got on with it, and there was amazing success that resulted from those changes. William Smedley started a choir of men and boys in 1884, and I believe that he's that guy. So big bearded mustache, looks like the right kind of figure, right? So within a few years, they had 60 boys in the program, according to a memoir that I found by one of the former choristers who was there in like the 1890s. So they had 60 boys, and they would sing usually matins and evensong on Sundays. And I think there was one service in the middle of the week. And when the boys' voices changed, they were then dispatched out to the other new Episcopal churches throughout the city, and they would start choirs there. So there used to be dozens of these men and boys choirs across Chicago in Episcopal churches, most of them led by graduates of the program here. So St. James, even though it wasn't the cathedral at that point, was really serving as the mother church of Chicago in so many ways. Peter Lutkin was the associate organist, so he mostly played the instrument, while William Smedley directed the choir. He started the School of Music at Northwestern while he was here, so he was going up and down the train line to begin that very consequential school. He wrote a piece of music that Northwestern and Westminster Choir College and a lot of colleges sing, called the Lutkin Benediction. You'll hear that in the concert on a week on Thursday as well. Again, very kind of saccharine and Victorian, but it's great. It originated in this space, it's sung all over the world. Really fun stuff. The next prominent musician here was Clarence Dickinson, who initially came on as an organist and then took over the choir when he returned. So you'll see he was here in two different periods. He was here kind of at the end of his studies at Northwestern. And he served first as organist. He was apparently an absolutely brilliant organist, sort of like Dudley Buck. So after a year here, the congregation helped to pay for him to go abroad to study with some of the luminaries in Europe. So Guimont, Vierne, who was at Notre Dame, Moskowski was a piano teacher. So he went over to Europe for about 5 years, I think, and refined his craft, brought a lot of that sense of classical music excellence into his composing and into his pedagogy to bring back here. He came back to Chicago and was our director of music from 1903 to 1909. During that time, he began a teaching career as well, and similarly, he has these fascinating memoirs about how he would do the services here with the men and boys, matins, and then evensong, then rush over to Symphony Hall, and he would lead the weekly Sunday musical festivity that became the television program that Robert used to direct, which I'm bringing.
Sunday Evening Club.
The Sunday Evening Club, that was it. So he would direct the choir at the Sunday Evening Club, or whatever it was called in that particular format. Then he would get on a train, and he would take a sleeper over to Iowa, where he would teach at a college, then come back a couple days later and lead a rehearsal here. It was just, it's amazing. His schedule was quite crazy. Very fine composer. He ended up moving to New York and became the director of music at the Brick Church, which is a very prominent Presbyterian church. And he started the School of Sacred Music at Union Theological Seminary. So the School of Music at Union Seminary, very much about training church musicians, ended up becoming the Institute of Sacred Music at Yale, which is where I went and where Nico went. So his legacy is really tied up in training a huge swath of church musicians. I would say pretty much every prominent Episcopal organist in the mid to late 20th century studied at either Union Theological Seminary or the National Cathedral School, which Leo Sowerby started. So those are both people from St. James training musicians all across the country. After Dickinson was John Norton, who was not a composer that I know of. I've not been able to find any of his music, but he was apparently a very strong choir trainer, because this was the choir in the 1950s. Yeah, you'll notice a couple missing elements there in terms of the kinds of people that were represented, but a wonderful swath of choir. So these are the choir stalls that used to exist in the chancel. This is our current chancel, believe it or not. You can see the reredos here. You can see this was all stenciled and painted around the sides. There were wooden little alcoves and nooks and things like this. And then 3 rows of stalls right at the forward point of the apse. You can see a hymn board. The communion rail was through here. I have no idea how the communion logistics worked, because everyone would have come up between the choir during the communion anthem, knelt, and then somehow scurried back down the side aisle. That must have been a mess. But again, this was an era when probably communion was done once a month at the most. This would have been more about morning prayer. So probably they weren't thinking about communion logistics so much. But I just love that sort of swath of people singing there. I think this is fantastic. So Norton left in 1925, and then they had a bit of a change, and I haven't really found documentation about exactly what happened and why decisions were made the way that they were. But 1925, actually for a brief time, they brought in Leo Sowerby, who was assistant at Fourth Press he was here for like 8 weeks or so as the interim. Then they brought in a new director of music named Percy DeCoster. He was only here for 18 months. And according to one source that I found, again, there are a lot of tall tales around here, so this is not gospel. I found it in only one source. He was found dead in a hotel room in New York City. So then they brought Leo Sowerby back. There's some sort of whiff of scandal about all this, and I hate to speculate or draw between the lines, but they also closed the men and boys choir at the same time and turned it into an adult choir, semi-professional like we have today. So 1925, 1926, somewhere in there is when the Cathedral Choir as we know it today was started. So we're also celebrating our 100th anniversary of the Cathedral Choir, more or less, which is kind of cool this year. Of course, it wasn't the Cathedral Choir yet, it was the St. James Parish Choir, but a very similar composition where it was about half volunteers and half staff singers. Leo Sowerby was the organist and choir master here with the longest tenure. He was here from 1927 until 1962. When Sowerby was here, he also taught at the American Conservatory of Music, which no longer exists, but trained a lot of composers and conductors of that era, including Ned Rorem, probably his most prominent student. Sowerby won the Pulitzer Prize in composition in 1947. He was the only active church musician to win the Pulitzer Prize. That's for a cantata called Canticle to the Sun. A very interesting piece. Not quite the top 10 of the Pulitzer winners, but it's there. Sowerby wrote just scads of church music while he was here at St. James. He had been an orchestral composer primarily in the early part of his career, but he wrote in some letters and some memoirs about how his experience working at St. James really drew him toward composing for choir, for organ, and seeing sacred music as something that was an equal pursuit to music in the concert hall. I think that's just absolutely wonderful that this community was able to help shape his vocation to what it became, to the consequential career that it became. So Sowerby wrote, I have no idea how many anthems he wrote. I mean, I have a filing cabinet, it's like this thick of single copies of anthems that he wrote, and I don't even have all of them. He wrote so much organ music. It's never all been recorded, but I estimated it would take at least 5 CDs to fit it all. Just a huge amount of music. He apparently wrote very meticulously every day for 3 hours, and he wrote very quickly and didn't really do a lot of drafts, so he would just finish stuff and send it off. So there's a lot out there. And some really wonderful stuff in there too. I think some of the finest American anthems were written by him here at St. James. Some of his organ pieces are some of the finest American organ pieces there are, full stop. So he was here really kind of at the glory days of this church's flourishing in the pre-war period. You can see here's Easter 1937. And you can see, of course, it's a choir of men and women in those original choir stalls. There seem to be some random choir boys on the side, and I don't know what the story is about them, but he clearly didn't think their participation was super important, given that they're behind people that are taller. This was a stage photo for either the Chicago Sun-Times or the Tribune, I can't remember. This was the spread on Easter Day in 1937. So you can kind of see the grandeur and the social importance that St. James had at the time. I mean, interesting stuff here just to note, like the pulpit is on the other side. Lots of things have changed about the space, but you can see the shell of what was. Sowerby is standing right here. They're processing out, which probably would happen during a hymn, and I think they're all pretending to sing, but he's not playing the organ because the organ console is over there. Kind of interesting. I will just divert from the presentation for a second to play a recording of his choir, and they are singing Passion Oratorio, Forsaken of Man, which our choir is going to do around Holy Week this year. It's not been done in decades here, but it's an absolutely fabulous piece. It's a very different sort of sound of choral singing from what you're hearing from the Cathedral choir today, but I think it's a fascinating little time capsule about how things were. This one was recorded in 1960, right at the end of this time. Lean expressive in its own way. It's a totally different style of singing than we do now. Sowerby was very much a product of the Midwest. He grew up in Grand Rapids and then moved here in high school to begin studying piano with the kinds of teachers that you could have in Chicago that you couldn't have in Grand Rapids. He was a prodigy. By the age of 18, he had a concerto performed at the Chicago Symphony. He performed at the piano with the CSO several times. In fact, up through the 30s, there was not a single season that went by where they didn't do at least one of his works, which is just remarkable. But he also never really worked outside of Chicago until the very end of his career. And I think that's interesting because he never really spent time with other places and other ways of choral singing. So it's a very kind of like Midwestern style of singing, I think, that he has. It's something like very expressive, very emotive, very sort of operatic. He didn't get the kind of European crystalline thing that I think informs our singing now. When he started, he had no kind of liturgical background, and I read a reflection that he wrote where he said he had programmed All Creatures of Our God and King during Lent one year. If you think through the words of that, you would see why that's a problem, because you sing the word Alleluia about 37 times. So after this happened, his rector was furious at him and said, what we need to do is we need to send you over to England and you need to go study with Boris Ward. So he went over to King's College, Cambridge, and sat there for 3 months and learned how to do Anglican, but that was the extent of his Anglican training, which I think is really interesting. So I think that just kind of all comes to bear in the style of music making that he was doing. It's much more more closely aligned to like the sound of the CSO chorus than with our modern way of thinking of church choir on to sound. So he was here right up until 1962, which is around the time when all of these renovations happened to make the space more modern. So St. James became the cathedral in 1955. A lot of people don't know that, but we were a parish church for much longer than we've been a cathedral. St. James became the cathedral in 55, but it was basically serving as the cathedral since 1925, when the cathedral that was on the west side burned down. There was a cathedral, St. Peter and Paul, a stone Gothic building, kind of like what you would expect. It burned down. And the diocese had tried to rebuild it in various configurations for a long time. There are some really cool archival images of the rendering of this monstrous Gothic cathedral with a tower full of diocesan offices, and they even purchased the land where the John Hancock is so that they could build this monstrosity facing down Fourth Press from across the street. I think probably fortunately for us and for our finances, they did not have the money to get that project off the ground, and they sold the land in the 30s because of the Depression. So they had all these hopes about building a bespoke cathedral. It was not going to happen, so they turned to St. James. And St. James agreed to become the cathedral in 1955. And part of the deal was clearly reconfiguring the space into something more conducive to a cathedral. There's a photo that I found somewhere of an ordination when they still had the choir stalls pressed way up into the front here. And it's literally the ordinands like lying prostrate on the choir stalls or like in between the rows. It looks so awkward. So there was not the space to do cathedral liturgy in that original orientation. So you can understand from that like why they decided to do what they did. And many of these elements have been retained today. Obviously, we redid the stenciling in the 1980s. The communion rail is no longer here. It's where you know it is. We now have the freestanding altar, all of these things. But the choir was then put over to the side, and apparently Sowerby was not happy about that at all because he played the rededication service and then left. And he wrote just a very sad letter that I found to a friend back here saying, I feel like all of my friends at St. James have forgotten me. I feel like I'm a dead man over there. And all this stuff. But things turned out pretty well for him. He became the founding director of the School of Church Music at Washington National Cathedral. So he had been really close with the musicians there. And they brought him in to start a place where you could get kind of a graduate degree in church music, almost on an apprentice model. So they would only have like 5 or 6 students each year, and each of these students would sort of take it in rotation to conduct the choir and play for services and do composition lessons with Sowerby and all these things. So he did that for the last 6 years of his life until he passed away. So really consequential figure, Sowerby. So the musical style at St. James definitely also transitioned around this time of becoming a cathedral. As you can see, there was just a widening of what worship was here. There were TV programs filmed, which this is a photo from. There were guitar masses. There were all sorts of things. The choir was retained, but of course put off into the loft, so sort of a different sound from that. In addition, there's been more of an emphasis on secular occasions, like the Rush Hour concerts, one of our most successful endeavors that have been going for over 20 years now. If you haven't been here on a Tuesday afternoon in the summer at 5:45, you should come. The cathedral is often full, with people just wanting to come hear some nice chamber music in a really beautiful space. In fact, when I see folks who are not Episcopalian in Chicago and I tell them where I work, often the first thing they say is, "Oh, that's where the Rush Hour concerts are." Right? So a really great way that we are able to fly our flag. Also, music in the neighborhood has not been so much a thing since the pandemic, but using the plaza for outreach events, for musical events, things like that, is very much a part of our DNA, and I think something that we're hoping to continue when and should we acquire this property so that we have the ability to do that again. When? Yes, absolutely. Yes. So the most significant modern adaptation of music, of course, has been the foundation of our chorister program, which we started 8 years ago, and now we're up to 20 kids, which is really exciting.
And they sound wonderful. I just have to say, they really, if you don't come on a Wednesday evening and hear them, you should, because they are awesome.
Absolutely. A lot of folks hear them at the 9 o'clock service too. So, yeah, they're really just going from strength to strength. And we've shown that you can have it all. You don't have to close the chorister program in order to start a really top-notch adult choir. So we have both things. We have the choir that Sowerby had, this mixed adult semi-professional choir singing at a very high level. And then we also have a formation-based children's program. And really the ethos of choristers coming from the English Cathedral model, it's a bit different than a children's choir. The idea is that we have them sing at the same level as the adults. They're driven to a professional standard, but in a way that's child-friendly. Because kids can really do it all. They are like little sponges in terms of learning. So they don't really know that a piece is hard unless you tell them that it's hard. So if you just put some handles beside it in front of them, they'll just go for it. You give them the pieces to learn how to do it, and they put pieces together faster than you can give them to them. So the choristers have increasingly been singing with the adults, which is a lot of fun. You'll hear them do that at Evensong next week during the pet blessing. So they've been working very hard on Britain's Rejoice in the Lamb and Hogan's Magnon and a few other things. Yeah, super proud of what the kids have done. The choir also has been growing from strength to strength. They are mostly downstairs rehearsing. Apparently they're done. Because clearly London have an easy time today. And just a wonderful community of folks too. One of the things that I read about Sowerby was the strength of the community at his time. There were several marriages that came out of the choir. They would always go out for a summer party at his vacation home in Michigan. All sorts of social things. And it sounds like it was a really tight-knit group of people. I think that's a tradition that we've carried forward in the Cathedral Choir very much as well. And then, of course, the next exciting development is our new organ, our new old organ. For those of you that don't know about this project, St. James acquired this really monumental cathedral organ in Britain at a church that was doing renovations and needed to get rid of the organ. So this instrument was the largest English organ built in the immediate post-war period by the Walker Company in Britain. You can actually see it in the workshop from an advertisement that they put out in the Musical Times at the era. So those are the little pieces that are currently being restored and will make their way here shortly. A couple years ago, we went over and took it out piece by piece. It filled 3 shipping containers and brought it across the pond, fortunately, before tariffs. So the entire duty was about $77, I think.
Good.
I don't know how that works, but so it's currently in the workshop being restored and will be ready to install here. For those of you that don't know about the sort of full extent of the organ project and think like, well, our current organ sounds fine. We make it sound fine, but actually about half of it has been removed and more of it keeps needing to be removed because the structure has started to collapse. So it's a matter of like urgency that we take this thing out, rebuild the structure, put a new organ in that's been properly assembled, because it's, with each passing year, it becomes more and more of a hazard of no longer being an organ, but being, on the ground. And this is also an absolutely marvelous instrument, and it gives us a chance to retain a piece of history in a responsible way. We're not using any new materials, we are using something that's already existing. And we're able to help this church out. They gave us this organ because it freed them of the burden of having to remove it themselves. So really a win-win situation. It's going to be a big organ. It has 3,507 pipes, which is slightly smaller than this organ when everything was there, but it's about twice the size of what's there now. It's going to have loads of color. It's going to be really, really exciting. And the plan is for it to be completed around December of 2026. So you'll need to keep an eye out on this space for all of the updates about the organ project. We're planning to begin the removal of this organ this summer, then prepare the organ chamber space for the new instrument, including shoring up all the structures and all the things that have been a problem, and then install it in the fall. So that's the next chapter of St. James music.
Yes.
And at this point, I would really invite your questions and anything you'd like to know about how music at St. James works. Because I know that I'm often not able to speak with you all because usually I'm leading the choir or something at this time. So I wanted to at least give 5 minutes to just allow for any questions. Yes?
You mentioned one time the choir sang without robes.
Yes.
When we finally got robes, were they always the burgundy color?
No, I'm not sure when the burgundy happened, but it's pretty recently because Sowerby's choir had black robes. So it was probably around the 1980s.
The burgundy robes are connected with our being a cathedral, and
Right.
so even though that started in 55,
Yeah.
it came in, and again, that creeping Anglo-Catholicism and popery and whatnot. I mean, St. James has been led by a lot of clergy who are a little further up the candle. You know, in the church we have low church, high church, broad church. As a cathedral and as the DNA of St. James has been broad church, somewhere in the middle. But certainly with Frank Griswold, certainly with Jim Montgomery and Frank Griswold, they were a lot more on the Anglo-Catholic side. I think that's probably when the idea about setting cathedral.
Just based on photos I've seen, the 1960s, they still had the black robes. So somewhere, my guess is around the time when they did the stenciling and the significant refurbishment of the space. That would make sense as to the time when you would make that kind of change. That's my guess, but I don't know. Folks who've been here a long time, maybe remember it. So. Yes?
Have you ever considered like any exchange programs? For example, St. Thomas on Fifth Avenue in New York also has like a lauded choir. Like, have y'all thought about those and sending students for like a week at summer?
Well, you know, actually, I know the new director there really well, and we talked about that this summer, which would be super fun. I talked about that with National Cathedral as well, but they've been between people. I've taken the choristers to National Cathedral, and they got to all sing with the cathedral choir there for an evening song, which was a great experience for them. I've taken our adult choir to New York. We sang a service at St. Thomas and St. Bart's and St. Catherine's. So we've done a little bit of that, but that's definitely a great way. We've also sent 2 choristers from our program to St. Thomas to become residential choristers there. Yeah.
I'm relatively new. What's your history here?
I've been here for 9 years. I was brought in really at an interesting time because there had been quite a lot of change at the cathedral overall. It was around the time, it was a year after Lisa started, or 2 years after Lisa started?
1 year.
Then Dominic had started, he was still new, he brought me on board. The choir was really in shambles. There were very few people in the adult choir. There had been a lot of turmoil over the various transitions. And is that thing still recording? Maybe we can edit this out. And we didn't do any favors with that regard. So I got the choir roster, and it was like 12 people. So first task was sort of building that back up, and then starting the chorister program was a task that had been in the job description to do. So that's sort of my history here. I came from St. Thomas, New York, as the assistant organist and interim director of music. School before that. Anything else? Yes?
I was curious, how much of this history about St. James were you aware of before you got here?
None.
Okay.
Not at all. I've done several articles about Sowerby. I actually never really liked his music before I got here. I've learned to love it. And it's been a nice sort of little niche to explore some of that history and publish it. So in the context of researching Sowerby, I've learned a lot about this. And then the Church in the City book has been really helpful. There was this memoir by a former chorister in the 19th century whose name escapes me, but that would be fun to get out there. It's on JSTOR or something. It's quite fantastical. Him talking about the choristers going on choir camp and how thoroughly unsupervised they were. They knew across the lake, and one kid drowned one year.
Okay, well, really make sure that this is not recorded.
It's 1890s. I think it was statutes of limitations.
There you go. What Stephen won't say, because he's too humble, is he has a very deep. When I was on the group that interviewed him, and I said, and all of us were like, why? Because he was a hot shot. He was at Fifth Avenue, St. Thomas Fifth Avenue. He was brilliant on the organ. He was brilliant conducting. We're like, why would you come to St. James? And you're a son of the Midwest.
Yes.
You're aware of this, and we saw in you really the seeds of what you've done. We've told a lot of people we want to have a children's choir. A lot of people have said it can't be done. He came here, he did it in a year. And damn it, I'm always crying around him. But I just, Stephen is incredibly humble, but absolutely brilliant. I have always said over the last 10 years, we are seeing and witnessing one of the next great figures in Episcopal Church music leadership. We're very along with his prodigious talents and skill in music and in teaching and in cultivating these kids. It's a beautiful thing to watch him with these children. He's an excellent writer and an excellent teacher. Thank you for sharing with us just a bit, and we look forward to being the wind under your wings as we go forward with the next part of the Warrior Project.
Thank you. I will leave you with one thought, and that is, at least from my perspective, St. James incredibly boasts the richest tradition of composers working in the history of the church, other than perhaps the National Cathedral. But that list of people that I gave you, like any other church, would be drooling over that. And I think it's a really cool legacy that we have this late 19th century through mid 20th century legacy of the top people in the field all working at this place in Chicago. It's something St. James really should be proud of. All right. I'm just gonna start